I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to be here in the morning. Did anybody in the 2 MRI sessions this morning mention BIDS? Okay, so quick poll from the room. Who has heard of BIDS? Very cool, very cool. Who really likes BIDS? That's a fascinating. Who finds BIDS kind of intimidating and a little unsure where to get started? Okay, so I'm like mostly targeting my talk to this crew at the back who put their hands up for that question. Some of the folks here will know an awful lot, but I'm really passionate about a community standard that is adopted by and built by as many people as possible. This is just a slide with a picture of me, and it says just who I am, but also that my sort of passion and the thing that I really care about is making it easy for people to share evidence of the work that they did. And when you just share a PDF of the end of like 3 years of doing just this monstrous amount of work, I don't think it really captures all of the usefulness that you could be sharing. So this is a little reproducibility spectrum. Probably many of you have already seen it. If you haven't, Roger Peng's paper in Science, I think, is a really nice kind of jumping off point for thinking about the fact that reproducibility is probably not a binary. There are degrees of reproducibility. And one of the things that I just said was that I think publication only is not good enough. But one of the things that's really kind of painful is that often, even if you have code and data and they're linked together, it's still really hard to actually run that code on somebody else's data, or to run that code on your own data. So as I said at the beginning, my sort of main passion is like imagining the graduate student that I have been in the past, who just sort of tries so desperately hard to be able to find the same results that have been published in previous papers and not succeeded. I have like many stories about my null results. But also, I love the idea of the things that you could do if we work together. So one of the things that the Alan Turing Institute is focusing on is data science and artificial intelligence. And in my opinion, you can only get the best potential out of those really fascinating algorithms if you have really good data that you can trust. And probably at this point in time, you also need a lot of data. So there will be some studies, and we've conducted some of them in this very building, but some studies will try to do all of that themselves. I don't think that's a very efficient way forwards. I'm more interested in trying to see how we can join together lots of different people's studies so that you can then do what would probably be classed as secondary data analysis on that combination. So this is where the brain imaging data structure comes in. It's a simple and intuitive way to organize and describe your neuroimaging and behavioral data. Whether it is simple and intuitive to you is possibly a little bit up for grabs. I'm going to go through some of the things that I personally did not find that simple and intuitive to start off with. But effectively, I know this is quite small, you don't really need to get the details, but effectively what it's doing is taking your DICOM directory, so the information that you get off of the scanner, and there are extensions for EEG, intracranial EEG, and MEG as well. So your raw data, and putting that into a folder structure. And it's, in its simplest way, it's just a way of naming files. In a sort of, it's actually more complex than just naming files. I said that to Chris Gorwesky, who sort of created and has led the development of BIDS, and he was like, it's not just naming files, Kirsty. And that's because there's a lot of metadata that goes along with those files, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that metadata is in a second. But in its simplest form, it's basically just storing those files when you convert them in a certain folder structure. And so my opinion is that BIDS is absolutely perfect if you have never done brain imaging before, because you're starting from scratch. So you might as well collect that file and convert it to this data structure. It's actually a bit harder if you're already in a lab that has its own folder structure and its own naming systems and lots of pre-processing code, for example, that goes along with those structures. And so one of the things that I think is really important for us to do as a community is help to build little translators between your lab system and BIDS, and possibly vice versa. Just give me another wave if you've heard of the FAIR acronym before. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, it's saying that data sets to be most useful should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And when I think about BIDS, what I get really, really kind of excited about is the interoperability of BIDS and the accessibility of BIDS. And those are the two main letters that I'm going to sort of talk about for the rest of the talk. So interoperable. This is just a little bit of a zoom in. This was made by Remy, of a little bit easier to see the raw, where you would put derivatives. So once you've done some processing on your files, and a folder called source data, which just basically sort of keeps everything for reference that you might need. And it's useful and it's really nice, and it's pretty intuitive once you sort of look at it. But there is also, there are these metadata files, there are these JSON files that sit alongside the, for example, Nifty files that we're used to. This is the dataset description file. It is a made up information. This is not actually a real experiment that you can download from OpenNeuro, but this is the mother of all experiments. There's a nice little acknowledgement section. There's some funding. There are some references. There's a digital object identifier. And the reason that I only spent like a really unreasonable amount of time trying to find a robot who was reading, but I was, there's like the majority of the talk is in that image right there. But what is really important about this file is that it is reasonably human readable, but it is also machine readable. So that's what the JSON structure allows you to do, and the formatting in this particular text editor that I've screen grabbed from shows you that this is a key, and this is the value, and there are these little pairs, and you can have a list, for example, so you can have multiple entries for funding. And what that allows us to do is read it, so you can read it, you can understand what this data set is telling you, but also write little chunks of code, little what we call BIDS apps, that will pull that information automatically and be able to present it for you. So that's the dataset description. There are other, and that's a JSON file, and I've sort of explained to you what a JSON file is, but I think that's one of the hardest, one of the most difficult sort of first steps with BIDS is knowing what on earth these metadata file formats are. And so what we have is a little description of a JSON file, and we have how to make one, how to read in one in MATLAB, how to write a JSON file. We have the same instructions in Python, and we have the same instructions in R. And we also have some instructions in this same web page on this file. It's called metadata file formats. Instructions in MATLAB of how to read in a tab-separated file, which is kind of like a comma-separated file, but with tabs. And the reason is that commas are quite common in sentences that you might write, whereas tabs are quite a lot more infrequent. So we have these tab-separated files, and you can write them in and read them in MATLAB, Python, and R. And these screen grabs are from the wiki of the BIDS Starter Kit. So here is where I'm going to transition to talking about accessibility. Now, when people think about accessible in terms of data, they probably mean that you can get it, that you can download it, that you can get it in some way. I think accessible is broader than that, definitely includes that, but it also includes, can you understand it? Do you find this information in a way that you can read? And when we put the files in this interoperable way, in the naming them in a standard way and putting information, metadata information in these associated JSON files or the tab separated files, we make them technically accessible. You show that the data is there. But what I really wanted to work on with the BID starter kit was making it sort of intuitively accessible and making it easy for you to find out a bit more. So Patrick Park was our Google Summer of Code student, and he did a huge amount of work on this GitHub repository of bringing in as much information as we possibly can to help people get, as it says in the name, started. Most of the content is in the wiki. So this is a GitHub page, it's open, you could go to it now. It's in a wiki page, and there are lots of different files and different pages that you can go to on the right-hand side there. I think one of the biggest pieces of work that we did was work on this contributing guidelines file. It's called contributing, and it says, thank you so much for being here. I went a bit big on the emojis when I was editing what Patrick had done. We have some information about how do you join the community. Well, literally every single one of you are now part of the community. I mean, I asked you already knew about BID, so you were already kind of part of the community, but that's how easy it is to be a member. There's no bar, you literally need to know that it exists. We also have information on finding ways to get in touch. So there's a channel in the BrainHack Slack organization, and you can join it. There's a Gitter channel, there's the BIDS mailing list, and there's the Neurostars forum. And can you give me a wave if you've used Neurostars? So there's not very many. Have you used Stack Overflow or something similar to Stack Overflow? There's a few more nods, yeah. So Neurostars is basically trying to be very similar to Stack Overflow for neuroscience, for neuroimaging questions. So if you look up questions that are tagged with BIDS, you can see a bunch of the different questions, and you can, and this is, I've just screen grabbed just one example. Somebody had a question, there were some errors, and we've got a few different answers that come down. Now, the main reason to ask your question on Neurostars rather than any of the other media is that ideally, if somebody else gets the same error message, they can go to Neurostars and find that, and you don't have to then have the maintainers of BIDS or the people, the experts, the people who know the answers, have to write out that answer over and over again. But even better, in my opinion, than going and searching Neurostars is capturing that thing that you learnt in the BID Starter Kit wiki. And so we also have in this contributing file some information about how you contribute through GitHub, if you've never done that before, a little bit of information about writing in Markdown, and where you can start with that thing that you learnt. And yeah, and I'm just going to say one thing here about the term expert blindness. It is my opinion that the best people to write the Starter Kit wiki are the people who are starting out. So literally, there's no question that's too silly or too small, because the people who are having those questions are exactly the people that we're trying to help. And once you get over it, it's actually really difficult to identify what isn't known. So that sentence that I sort of was a bit sassy about it being simple and intuitive, it is simple and intuitive after you spend a bit of time with it. But I would really, really love to encourage anybody here, if you start doing any work with BIDS, to come along and find the page on the wiki that you wish that information was in and add it. Or talk to us about how we could help you to add that information. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go way, way faster, but the starter kit was like the main thing that I wanted to tell you about. It is also the case that BIDS doesn't work for everything. And so there are also BIDS extensions. So if you have a particular type of scan data, for example, the EEG, MEG, but even if you have a different type of MRI sequence that you've collected that isn't currently represented in the standard, you can extend BIDS. And that was the page in the starter kit. This is a bit more of a detailed Google Doc that tells you about how you might pull together a proposal to contribute to BIDS. This is the flowchart that I really love so much. You complete a little draft, you have call for feedback, you send it to members of the community. Is consensus reached? no. And it goes into this loop for a little while, and then eventually you extend out the validator and it will get merged into bids. And so I'm working on one of those for structural MRI, and anyone's welcome to ask me any questions about that in the break. Very, very quickly, because I have taken up all of my time on the things that I think are the most important. The findable of bids is OpenNeuro. So you can go to OpenNeuro and you can either download publicly available data sets from there, or you can upload your data sets to make them more findable for others. And reusable, this is a project which is very near the beginning of its life, but I really, really like it. It's called PsycDS, it's the Psych data structure, and it was inspired by BIDS to help people who run psychology experiments, probably behavioral psychology experiments, to share their data in a somewhat standardized way. So this project is led by a team of folks who gave presentations at MozFest last month, and they are have a call open for anyone who's interested in forming a way of sharing your, for example, tab-separated, comma-separated files with behavioral data so that other people can use it. So the whole of BIDS as a standard is reusable for other purposes. My last point is to echo what I said at the very beginning, that it is really pointless to build a standard for sharing brain imaging data if it's not useful to people. It has to be built by the community and it has to be used by the community. So you've probably seen this. Anyone who's spent any time thinking about standards knows that this is the case. You have 14, you say that's ridiculous, and so in the end you build the 15th standard. And it's my opinion that the solution to this is the community aspect, is the bringing everybody else in so that you can extend and build out BIDS to be useful for as many people as possible. So that's my final message. Come and chat with me, send me a tweet, send me an email, and thank you to everybody who's contributed in all of these various different ways, and thank you to you for listening.
Any questions about the emojis or otherwise? So what's the timeline for the other? You said EEG doesn't yet have a bid standard, or it's improved?
EEG has an extension. So if you had EEG data, I would recommend that you go and have a look at their extension. So it won't be in the main specification, but it is making good progress. And I think that, and I know that the MEG standard is already merged in, and the EEG is sort of very heavily inspired by the work that the MEG team did. So that document will exist probably as a Google Doc, and you can go and sort of see what they've sort of figured out so far. And then the timeline is very difficult because, in a sense, like nobody is paid to do the work for extending BIDS and for even sort of running BIDS. So it will, when people have time to move it forwards, that's the time that it will take to go forwards. But I do know that the EEG team are making really good progress on theirs.
So methods, the Open Science Day, someone proposed this idea of the bus factor. How many people need to be hit by a bus for this to grind to a halt?
Yeah.
So what's the bus factor for BIDS?
For BIDS. So the bus factor for BIDS is sort of one in that I think if Chris went, we might all sort of flop down to the floor and go, oh, we've lost our great leader. And if you look, he's like making a mess of all of my like laying out these screen grabs because he does all of the different things. But I didn't make this very clear in my sort of the R of FAIR and the reusability, but because we're trying to build BIDS in a transparent way, all of the work that is done is available. So while the bus factor is sort of technically one, because I think we really would it would be very difficult without Chris. He's put so much work into it. It could actually be picked up. There are a lot of people on that list that have been involved in bids right from the beginning and have been very involved in making a lot of the decisions. But just to be super, super clear, the goal, one of my big goals of having so many, of calling for people to join the community, is to minimize that bus factor risk. Yeah, to have as many people understand and know about it as possible. And one of the things that I'll just say that this little emoji, you could get this emoji next to your name by literally taking these slides and giving a little presentation at your lab meeting. And that would count, and you'd be a member and you'd get a little emoji, and that's obviously what we all kind of care about. But also that's like an extremely valuable contribution to bids, and it takes away from Chris being the only person that gets asked to give talks about this sort of stuff.
Okay, I think in the interest of time we should move on.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.